September 21st, 1945. That was the night I died, intones the eerily red spirit of Sita, a 14-year-old Japanese boy. He turns away to see an image of his body, sitting at a great column inside one of Japan's train stations, just before his death. The people of the train station, who pass by saying things like, "Damn tramps, disgusting, and it's disgraceful having these bums here." One lady leaves a rice ball beside Sita, but he's too weak to even look at it and pick it up with his hands. Janitors come to clean up and find Sita and several other tramps, all dead or almost dead. The first one pokes Sita with the end of his broom, and of course Sita doesn't move. Another one, he says, then examines the dead boy. He discovers an old candy tin, opens it, and tastes a bit of whatever is inside. He asks his co-worker what it was, but he tells the first janitor to just throw it away. He takes the tin outside and pitches it into a field, startling the fireflies into flight. The lid pops off, and bits of cremated bone fall out. They are the bones of Setsuko, Sita's sister. As the fireflies fly up from their grass perches, Setsuko's spirit appears, the same eerie red as her brother, and stands up from a crouch. She looks around, a little disoriented, then notices the dead body of her brother lying in the train station. She almost goes to him, but Sita's spirit catches her shoulder. She smiles, and he nods. He reaches down and picks up the rusted candy tin, and suddenly it is like new again. He gives it to Setsuko, and they walk off together as the title card appears. The flashback begins with dozens of American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying overhead. Sita starts to run, with his sister still on his back holding her doll, when suddenly flames burst out of a second-floor window on his left, and out the front door of a house on his right, sending pieces of wood flying into the street. Setsuko screams. The flames are so hot that the windows shatter and sliding doors are blown out. All of the buildings around them are in flames, and black smoke billows into the sky. They run as more flaming debris begins falling into the street. The planes continue their bombing until the sky looks like night because of the smoke. Hundreds of townspeople flee in the opposite direction that Sita is trying to go. Nobody takes notice of the two children, even when they bump into them. It's too difficult, so Sita turns and runs with the crowd, who crowd around beneath bridges and become too jammed with people. Sita takes his sister down a side road, running past more fleeing families, and a group trying to douse some flames with a hand-powered water pump. More and more people are in the streets, panicking and tripping and running past the fallen. The bombing continues right on top of the fleeing citizens, some landing near Sita and Setsuko as they flee towards an as yet undamaged part of the city, where only a few people remain, packing up a handcart. Sita carries his sister to a dried-up canal and stops between some bunkers. He sits down and unstraps Setsuko, who clings to his arm, trembling. He breathes hard, exhausted. We see a dead soldier face down in a puddle, the flames nearing him, including the crying baby, huddled together watching the flames around them, beneath a red sky. He can hear the buildings collapsing on the other side of the levee. With Setsuko on his back, he climbs out of the canal and sees what's left of the town. At first it appears that only one building remains in the distance, and that everything else has been burned completely to the ground. Smoke is everywhere. The survivors wander around the town among burned-out streetcars and bodies. Others are digging up whatever might be saved from the destroyed houses. Sita and Setsuko watch all of this as they walk down the path. The school looks a little scorched itself, but it has survived. In one room, a group of men, women, and children are talking and sleeping and crying and playing. Outside, lines are forming at a booth where survivors are to check in and receive first aid. Sita runs inside the school and looks around. The man leads Sita past a room full of the wounded and into another room. His mother is on a mat on the floor, her upper body and head totally covered in bloody bandages. She's just now fallen asleep. Sita is too shocked to speak at first. Sita goes outside and finds Setsuko. He says Mom's hurt, but she'll get better. She asks him where she is, and he tells her that she's in the hospital in Nishinomiya. Setsuko looks down sadly. We'll stay here at the school tonight, he tells her. Then tomorrow we'll go to our aunt's place in Nishinomiya. Setsuko ignores him, she wanting to see her mother. He tells her they'll go tomorrow, because it's too late. She ignores him and grinds the sand with her shoe. She starts crying and kneels down. He walks off closer to the pull-up bars and sits down. After a while, just when it starts to get unbearable, Saita jumps on the highest bar and starts rolling over it, over and over, asking Setsuko to look. A day or so later, Saita returns to the ruins of his hometown district. Now that the sky is clear, a few more buildings can be seen that weren't destroyed. Saita finds his backyard and digs up the goods that he had stored there when the bombing began. He pulls everything out of the buried pot and stops and smiles at a tin of fruit drops. He puts them in his pocket and then puts the rest in the handcart that he borrowed. He pulls it along for a while, then he finds a broken water main. Saita parks the cart, takes a drink, and then rinses off the sweat and heat. He dries off and notices the candy tin again when he puts the towel back in his pocket. Then he's off again, after trying one of his pickled plums. That night, Saita takes a bath with Setsuko at another person's house. Afterwards, they walk outside and are surrounded by fireflies. Saita catches one and holds it out to Setsuko. It flies away before she can grab it. As they walk home, the air becomes filled with fireflies. They stop to stare at them. Saita tells his sister to close her eyes and say "ah," then reaches into his pocket and pulls out some of the fruit drops. He puts one in Setsuko's mouth. She recognizes the taste and starts dancing around, shouting "fruit drops" so excitedly that she almost swallows it. Saita asks Setsuko if she'd like to go to the ocean, and of course she's excited about going. They walk at first, but then Saita lifts her onto his shoulders. They pass by vegetable gardens and wet rice fields, a biplane and a hangar and a trolley. They look out on the ocean for probably the first time since the bombing. It looks normal, as if nothing has happened. They run onto the sand, doing cartwheels. Saita takes off his shirt, and the outline of his ribcage is visible through his skin. Then she runs in deeper, dunking herself into the sea. Saita chases her back to shore and across the sand, pretending to be a big bear. The old lady and the boy stare at them. Saita catches her, and then they sit down against the levee and suck on fruit drops. At the aunt's house, Saita makes a fire in the stove. Saita and Setsuko eat in their room, and he sprawls out bad-mannerly after he finishes. That's all the rice he and his sister received to last them through June. One night in the summer, following an air raid, they decide to move into an abandoned bomb shelter. One day, Saita and Setsuko are visiting a farmer. An American fighter strafes the strip of road they are on. Saita dives with his sister into a tomato field, barely escaping being hit. He looks up, and a tomato is right there in his face. He takes it and bites into it, then gets another for Setsuko. She asks him if they really should be doing that, and Saita nods yes. He then grabs more for later. Saita and Setsuko carry the food they found through town and come upon a police officer walking his bike. Setsuko drops some potatoes right in front of him. He reaches down to pick them up for her, but Saita walks past, quickly picking them up as he goes. Setsuko follows, hiding the other potatoes behind her back. The officer watches them suspiciously, so Saita picks up Setsuko and makes a break for it. It begins to rain on the way, flooding ditches and making their rice stove useless for the time being. After the rain, the two hang their wet clothes up on a line, and Saita brushes Setsuko's hair next to the lake while their vegetables and fish are cooking. At night, Saita returns to the fields and pulls up some sugar plants and other vegetables. A farmer catches him and accuses him of being the one who's been stealing crops in that area. Police tells the farmer to leave, then tells the farmer that he's knocked the boy around enough. Outside, Setsuko has been waiting for her brother. When he comes out, he sees her, then looks away. Setsuko runs up to him and hugs his legs. He begins to cry, so she asks him if he's hurting somewhere, and if she should get a doctor. The next morning, Saita leaves Setsuko at the shelter and runs off to the city as American fighters fly overhead. A corsair dive bombs some houses as townspeople dive into foxholes. Saita runs towards the explosions and then goes in an empty house. He grabs a conveniently located knapsack and fills it with goods. He finds a steamer full of rice and digs in. He saves some for Setsuko, along with some pumpkin. When he returns to the shelter, he finds Setsuko lying on her mat, holding her dolly. Another night, Saita hears the air raid sirens sounding, so he sneaks out of the shelter and heads to town. It's another firebombing. People flee, carrying few items, save what can fit in a side sack or two. Saita runs past them, against the tide, as if suicidally drawn to the danger. He invades more homes, stealing kimonos. As a bomber flies overhead, Saita, fat from wearing the kimonos under his shirt, cheers. It's starting to get light when he returns, though the fireflies are still out. Later, he leaves Setsuko again to try to trade off the kimonos. When Setsuko wakes, she can't find her brother anywhere. When he returns to the shelter, but notices Setsuko's doll on the path. He looks around and finds her at the bottom of the hill. She's lying still, as if she's dead. Even a fly crawling on her cheek doesn't generate so much as a reflex. Saita puts his hands on her shoulders, and she breathes out. She rolls her eyelids open and looks up weakly at Saita. Next day, when come from hospital, Saita carries her down the road. They stop by a man cutting a block of ice in two. When he carries half of it inside a house, Saita takes his sister over to a pile of ice shavings. He puts some in her mouth. Back at the shelter, Setsuko is lying on her mat, holding her doll and candy tin. He pulls out the watermelon finally and shows it to her. He cuts out a wedge with his pocket knife and puts a piece in her mouth. She's slow to chew and chews slowly. He puts the wedge in her hand, then breaks the watermelon in two on his knee, leaving both halves beside his sister. He carries the food outside to cook. She seems to fall asleep. The voice of the spirit Sita breaks in. Setsuko never woke up. The typhoon arrives and the food Saita prepared for Setsuko is uneaten. He lies beside her then. During the worst of the storm, he holds her. On a hill in an opening in the forest, Sita prepares his sister for the cremation. The smoke rises straight up into the sky as Saita kneels before it, watching, waiting until it finally burns out late that night. Saita watches the fireflies for a while. The spirit Setsuko calls, and the spirit Saita appears again. He's holding the candy tin. Setsuko runs up and sits down on the bench with him. He hands her the candy tin, and he tells her it's time for bed. She lays her head in his lap as he holds her. Then out at the city, rebuilt with giant skyscrapers. The fireflies dance around Saita and Setsuko.